Hello biology students, and welcome to the first video of the evolution unit. So in this unit we're going to be discussing the main mechanism for evolution, which is known as natural selection. So before we get going talking about natural selection, I want to define a couple of vocabulary words. So we've already seen a few of these vocabulary words in previous units, but I think it's important to revisit them so we understand these words as we go forward. So when we talk about the theory of evolution, there are actually a couple of vocab words that we can see right in that statement. So the first one is a theory. So a scientific theory does not mean the same thing as using the word theory does in regular English. So in regular English, when you're talking about a theory, you mean an idea you have or a hunch you have that may or may not be right. But it actually means the exact opposite in science. A theory in science is something that is well supported, has been tested over and over and over again, and it's basically just as close to true as we can get without going to what we call a law. So we do not mean a hypothesis here. We mean something that's been tested and proven to be most likely true. And then evolution means the process of change in heritable traits within a population over many generations. So in other words, when we're looking at evolution, we're looking at how groups of individuals change as time passes. So here, I do want to point out, we're looking at how a population changes. So we're not looking at how one individual changes, we're looking at how the population on the whole changes. And remember, a population are members of the same species living in the same ecosystem. So we can't really talk about evolution and natural selection without talking about Charles Darwin, because he really was the father of natural selection. He was the one who came up with this whole idea. So what he did for his work is he worked in the Galapagos Islands in the early 1800s. And if you didn't know, this is a small group of islands that's located off South America. And this group of islands is very unique because each island has a different climate. So he went from island to island, and he basically noticed that on each island, many species look similar to the species on other islands, but they were just a little bit different. So he studied many different animals. He studied tortoises, iguanas, and finches, and he's probably most known for his work with finches. And he noticed that, like I said, the finches from island to island look very similar to one another, but they were just a little bit different. And after he observed these characteristics, he kind of wondered, hey, like, how closely related are these finches? Did they used to be all one species? And then did they diverge and become slightly different? Were they always different? So what happened? So he published his findings in probably one of his most famous books on the origin of species. And basically he presented the idea that evolution has been happening for millions of years, and it's been doing so through this process known as natural selection. Okay, so let's actually look at some of Darwin's finches. So basically, on each island had a different environment, and the different environment meant that there were different food sources. So on one island, there might have been lots of fruit, and in one island, there might have been lots of insects, and one that there were cactus, and some that had different seeds. And he noticed that the finches on each island had beaks that were ideal for the food source that was available. So even though all the same finches looked kind of similar, so he thought that they might have once been one species, each had evolved to have a beak that was good for eating a particular type of food. So finches that had to crush seeds had very hard, tough, short beaks. Finches that had to eat fruit had more slender beaks that were good for getting the fruit out of the trees, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so let's talk about Darwin's theory a little bit. So Darwin's theory was called natural selection. And basically, there are 4 requirements for natural selection to take place. He proposed that there has to be overpopulation in a species. There has to be pre-existing variation in that population. There has to be a struggle for survival, and then there has to be varied reproductive success. So if that doesn't make quite sense to you right now, that's fine, because over the next couple of slides, we're going to talk through these 4 concepts and how they lead to a population changing over time or evolving. Okay, so the first requirement was that there has to be overpopulation. In other words, organisms have to produce more offspring than the environment can support. You can kind of think if there are very few offspring around, no one is going to survive better than someone else because there will be plenty of resources for everyone. So therefore, in order for evolution to happen, there has to be kind of a reason for change. There has to be not enough resources to go around. So overpopulation has to happen first. So secondly, there has to be variation. In other words, each individual in a population has to be a little bit different than the other individuals in the population. And that's because if a population is going to change, one trait has to be more favorable than the other. Another really important thing that I want to point out is this variation has to be genetic. In other words, whatever variant in the traits that exist, they have to be able to be passed down to the next generation. So they have to be coded for in the DNA, whether that be a protein or a behavior. But if they're not coded for in the DNA, the population won't change over time because once those organisms die, that trait will die with them if it's not genetic. Okay? So the third thing is there has to be a struggle for survival. So this kind of relates a little bit to the overpopulation. Basically, there has to be limited resources, and this will lead to competition. And with competition, only individuals who have the best traits will survive. So again, there has to be overpopulation that leads to competition for a struggle for survival. And then there has to be variation where there is a favorable variant that will do better over the other variants. Okay? So in other words, by competing in the face of challenges, whether disease, limited resources, competition for mates, etc., some members of the population survive and others will not. And that will eventually lead to change in the population. By the way, here's a new vocab word, fitness. Again, you've heard this word in English. It means working out, being fit. It actually means something very different in science. In evolutionary theory, fitness is basically how well you can survive and reproduce. So if you're really good at foraging for food, you would have higher fitness. If you were really good at finding mates and reproducing, you would have high fitness. If you were really strong and good at beating out competitors, you would have high fitness. So it generally means the ability to survive and reproduce well. Okay, so then the final requirement is that there has to be varied reproductive success. And this just basically means that the people who have the best traits and survive the best, they're the ones who have to have the most offspring. Because you can kind of imagine, if I have a really, really good trait and I survive well and have lots of children, my children will also have that trait, and that trait will become more present or more frequent in the population. So in other words, if you have a really, really good trait and it helps you survive and then you just die and don't pass that trait on, that's not going to lead to natural selection. That's not going to lead to evolution. You have to pass that trait on so your trait becomes more common in the population. So basically, if you have a good trait and you pass that trait on more often, the frequency of those inherited favorable traits will increase in the population over time. And this leads to what we call an adaptation. And what an adaptation is, it's a heritable trait. So the trait that's in your genes that's very common in the population. In other words, almost everyone has it because it improves fitness. Okay, so let's just walk through an example. So imagine that I had a population of giraffes, and they lived in an area where there are lots of trees. And as the trees start to grow, increased in height due to growth, the food for the giraffes got higher and higher. So imagine that some giraffes were kind of short, some giraffes were kind of tall, and some were in the middle. And remember that this length in the giraffes' necks and their heights is totally due to a gene, so it's genetic. So basically, the giraffes that had the longer necks would live longer because they are better at getting food, and if they're living longer, they're going to have more offspring. Now, if they have more offspring, most likely their offspring are going to inherit this long neck trait. So now a few generations later, we have a higher percentage of long neck giraffes. So over thousands of years, as this continued to happen, eventually all the giraffes had very long necks. And this is considered to be an adaptation, a trait that allows them to survive in a given environment. So this picture is showing the exact same thing. So imagine some giraffes thousands and thousands of years ago. Some were pretty short, some were pretty tall. Only the ones that were taller that had a gene that made them have a longer neck were able to eat. The short ones died out without having offspring because they did not get food, and the tall ones reproduced to have more tall giraffes. Till eventually, thousands of years later, most of the population is long-necked, tall giraffes. Okay. Basically, the idea is that there is some mutation, there is some change in the DNA. Hopefully, this mutation is advantageous. Maybe this mutation helps someone survive better in their environment. So this is on the individual level. Like one person gets a mutation. Eventually, because that person lives longer and has more offspring, if their mutation was favorable, there will now be a variation in the population. So now we're on the population level. So some people in the population have this favorable mutation and some don't. And then because this mutation is favorable, over time, those people will survive longer, have more offspring, until the vast majority or even all of the population has it. So now we're on the whole population level, and that is when it's called an adaptation, when almost everyone has it. Okay, so I want you to notice, individuals do not evolve, right? Populations evolve. Populations change over time. You might be lucky and be born with a mutation that helps you survive, but we only get evolution when we're seeing the whole population adopt this trait through natural selection. So finally, there are three main types of adaptations that we categorize. There are ones that are considered anatomical. So these are things like plants developing thorns, porcupines having quills, or animals having camouflage. There are physiological ones, so things like the way photosynthesis works or the way cellular respiration works. These are things that relate to processes or functions. And then finally, the third one is behavior, because a lot of behavior are linked to proteins in your genes. So maybe the way animals hunt or the way birds have an internal system to help them migrate in the winter. All of these things are three types of adaptations. So I have a couple of cool pictures that just show some anatomical adaptations. You can see here, this little crab spider has an anatomical adaptation that makes him camouflage in with this flower. Similarly, the praying mantis here, which you might not even be able to see, but you can see he's right here. He has an anatomical adaptation that allows him to blend in with the flower he lives on. And finally, the last example, and I'm sorry all the examples are anatomical, they're the easiest to show in pictures, is this little mantid has developed an adaptation to look like the leaves that he lives on to camouflage. So that's it for the natural selection video, and I'll see you in the next one.